You're not a real man, Michael. You never have been, not in the ways that truly count. The words delivered by my younger sister, Brenda, with the casual cruelty only family can sometimes muster, hung in the air of my parents' dining room, thick and acrid like gun smoke after a misfire. The Sunday roast, usually a symbol of comforting tradition, suddenly felt like a prop in a badly staged play. My mother, Eleanor, flinched, her hand fluttering to her chest as if to ward off a physical blow. My father, Robert, stared fixedly at his plate, his silence a familiar retreat. Brenda's husband, Gary, a man whose primary accomplishment seemed to be his ability to agree with his wife on all matters, nodded sagely, a smug little smirk playing on his lips. My name is Michael Anderson, 53 years old, a colonel in the United States Army, and for the past 30 years, I've dedicated my life to serving my country, leading men and women in situations most people only experience in nightmares, making decisions where the stakes are measured in lives, not dollars or social standing. But here, in this familiar room, surrounded by the people who had known me since birth, I was apparently nothing. Or at least, not a real man by Brenda's newly minted definition, a definition I suspected had more to do with her recent obsession with a particularly aggressive talk radio host than any actual understanding of manhood. I didn't react outwardly. Years of command, of maintaining composure under fire, had taught me the futility of engaging with an irrational adversary on their terms. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of water, my gaze steady, meeting Brenda's challenging stare without aggression, without defensiveness. It was a look I'd used many times before, one that conveyed a calm assessment of a developing situation, a quiet weighing of options. Brenda, mistaking my silence for weakness, pressed her advantage. I mean, really, Michael, all this running around the world, playing soldier. It's not like you're building a business, creating wealth, contributing to the real economy. Gary here, she gestured towards her husband, who puffed out his chest slightly. He just closed a major deal for his company. That's tangible. That's making a difference. Gary's major deal, I knew from my father's exasperated recounting, involved selling a slightly outdated software package to a mid-sized regional distributor, a transaction that had netted him a modest commission and an inflated sense of self-importance. My playing soldier, on the other hand, had recently involved overseeing the strategic withdrawal of forces from a volatile region, a complex logistical and diplomatic ballet, where a single misstep could have had catastrophic international repercussions. But such distinctions were clearly lost on Brenda and Gary. Their world was one of quarterly reports and sales targets, of bonuses and stock options, a world I had chosen to forego for one of duty, honor, and a different, less easily quantifiable form of contribution. My mother finally found her voice, a quavering protest. Brenda, dear, that's not fair. Michael works very hard. He's a colonel, for goodness sake. Oh, mother, please, Brenda sighed, rolling her eyes with an air of profound weariness, as if explaining a complex theorem to a particularly slow child. Titles are just titles. What does he actually do? What does he own? He lives in government housing, drives a government car when he's even in the country. It's not a life, it's an extended tour of duty with no real payoff. The irony was I own a modest house, fully paid for, rented out while I was overseas. I had a healthy investment portfolio, managed by a trusted advisor, built from years of disciplined saving and the not inconsiderable hazard pay that came with some of my assignments. But these are details I rarely shared with my family. Their understanding of wealth was tied to visible consumption, to the acquisition of things, not the quiet accumulation of security or the intrinsic value of service. I could see my father shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Robert was a good man, a decent man, but he was also a man who craved approval, who was easily swayed by the opinions of others, especially his outspoken daughter. He worked as a senior project manager for a local aerospace components manufacturer, a solid, respectable job, but one that, in Brenda's eyes, also lacked the glamour of Gary's supposed entrepreneurial prowess. He wouldn't defend me, I knew. He never did, not when Brenda launched these verbal assaults. He would retreat into his silence, hoping the storm would pass. This time, however, the silence felt different, heavier. The insult wasn't just a dismissal of my career. It was a fundamental questioning of my worth, my very identity as a man, delivered with a cold, public precision. The roast beef on my plate suddenly seemed unappetizing. The familiar comfort of my parents' home felt alien, a hostile territory where my life's work was not just misunderstood, but actively denigrated. I consider my options. I could rebut Brenda's claims, point by point, detailing the complexities of modern military command, the strategic importance of my work, the very real sacrifices involved. But what would be the point? Her mind was closed, her definition of success already cast in the base metals of commerce and conformity. I could express my anger, my hurt, but that would only give her the satisfaction of having provoked a reaction, of having found a chink in the armor of the stoic soldier. Instead, I chose a third option: observation. I would watch, listen, analyze. This was a new kind of battlefield, a domestic one, but the principles of engagement remained the same. Understand your adversary. Assess the terrain. Identify your objectives. And wait for the opportune moment to act, or, in some cases, to allow events to unfold in a way that revealed the inherent flaws in the enemy's position. The opportune moment, I suspected, might be closer than Brenda imagined. My father had been unusually agitated all week, talking incessantly about a crucial meeting he had on Monday with his company CEO, a Mr. Alastair Harrison, a man Robert spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. Mr. Harrison, it turned out, was also scheduled to make a brief appearance at my parents' home this very evening, a detail Brenda was either unaware of or had conveniently forgotten in her eagerness to belittle her older brother. This Sunday dinner was about to become significantly more educational. The decision to join the Army 30 years ago hadn't been a difficult one for me, though it had been a profound disappointment to my father. Robert had envisioned a different path for his only son, a solid, predictable career in business or perhaps engineering, like his own father. He saw the military as a last resort, a place for those who couldn't find their footing in the real world. My motivations were more complex. It wasn't about a lack of options. It was about a search for something more. I'd grown up in a household where appearances mattered, where success was measured by the size of one's house or the make of one's car. Brenda had absorbed these lessons early, adopting them as her own personal gospel. I, on the other hand, had always felt a certain unease with this superficiality, a yearning for a different kind of challenge, a different definition of worth. The structure, the discipline, the clear sense of purpose offered by the military appealed to something deep within me. It was a world where merit was earned, not inherited, where leadership was tested in crucibles of unimaginable pressure, where the stakes were far higher than any quarterly profit margin. My early years were a blur of rigorous training, demanding assignments, and the slow, steady climb through the ranks. I learned about logistics, about strategy, about the intricate dance of diplomacy and force. I learned about the weight of command, the profound responsibility of leading others into harm's way, the quiet grief that accompanied loss. These were experiences that shaped me, that forged a resilience and a clarity of thought that I carried into every aspect of my life. My family, however, saw only the surface. They saw the long absences, the missed holidays, the perceived instability of a life lived on the move. They couldn't or wouldn't understand the deep satisfaction that came from serving a cause larger than oneself, the camaraderie of a brotherhood forged in shared adversity, the quiet pride of a mission accomplished against overwhelming odds. I remembered one particular Christmas, early in my career, when I'd returned home on a short leave after a grueling 6-month deployment in a particularly volatile region of the Balkans. I was a young captain then, still carrying the raw weariness of command in a conflict zone. Brenda, then in her early 20s and already deeply immersed in her pursuit of a wealthy husband, had looked at my slightly worn uniform with a critical eye. "Honestly, Michael," she'd said, wrinkling her nose, "don't they pay you enough to buy some decent clothes? You look so drab." Gary, then just her ambitious boyfriend, had chimed in, Yeah, Mike, you should get into sales like me. Real money, real opportunities. This army thing, it's a dead end, mate. I hadn't bothered to explain that the drab uniform represented a commitment they couldn't fathom, that the dead end had just involved navigating a minefield of ethnic tensions and political instability to deliver humanitarian aid to a besieged village. It would have been like trying to describe color to someone born blind. My father, on that occasion, had simply cleared his throat and changed the subject, his usual tactic when faced with a conversational impasse he didn't wish to navigate. His disappointment in my career choice had been a constant, unspoken undercurrent in our relationship. He never openly criticized it, not directly, but his pride was reserved for his own achievements in the aerospace industry, for his carefully cultivated professional image. He'd talk at length about his projects, his presentations, the importance of his role in the company, while my own accomplishments were met with a polite, if somewhat vacant, nod. It wasn't malice, I understood that. It was simply a failure of imagination, an inability to comprehend a world so different from his own. He valued the tangible, the predictable, the linear progression of a corporate career. The abstract concepts of duty, honor, strategic influence. These were alien landscapes to him. My mother, Eleanor, was different. She worried, of course, as mothers do. But beneath the worry, there was a quiet pride, a respect for the path I had chosen, even if she didn't fully understand its demands. She was the one who kept my press clippings, the small, infrequent mentions in local papers when one of my units achieved a notable success or when I received a promotion. She was the keeper of my secret archive, a silent testament to a life lived largely out of their sight. The current dinner table assault by Brenda was, therefore, not an anomaly, but an escalation. Her derision had always been there, simmering beneath the surface of polite family gatherings. But tonight, it had a sharper edge, a more deliberate intent. Perhaps Gary's minor success had emboldened her. Perhaps her own life, despite its carefully curated facade of contentment, was not as fulfilling as she pretended, and lashing out at me was a convenient way to deflect her own insecurities. Or perhaps it was simply the culmination of years of accumulated misunderstanding, of a fundamental inability to see me for who I was, rather than who they wished I would be. As Brenda continued her monologue, now veering into a patronizing lecture on the importance of building a personal brand and leveraging social networks for financial gain, concepts that sounded like they'd been lifted directly from one of Julian Vance's seminars, I found my mind drifting to a recent conversation with a young major under my command. He'd been struggling with a difficult decision, one that involved significant personal risk but was crucial for the success of our mission. We talked for hours, analyzing the variables, weighing the potential outcomes, the ethical implications. In the end, he made the right call, a courageous one. The quiet satisfaction in his eyes, the knowledge that he had met a profound challenge with integrity and skill, that I thought was a payoff Brenda and Gary would never comprehend. It was a currency not traded on any stock exchange, a form of wealth not measured in bank balances or designer labels. It was the bedrock of a life lived with purpose. And that, I knew, was something very real indeed. The anticipation of Mr. Harrison's arrival was now adding another layer of complexity to the evening's already strained dynamics. My father, Robert, was a man of routines and carefully managed anxieties. His career at Aerodyne Industries, a mid-tier supplier of aerospace components, was his defining achievement, the bedrock of his identity. He'd started as a junior draftsman and, through decades of diligent, if uninspired, work, had risen to the level of senior project manager. It was a respectable position, one that afforded them a comfortable, if not lavish, lifestyle in their well-maintained suburban home. But Robert always seemed to aspire to something more, a level of recognition and influence that perpetually eluded him. His current boss, Alastair Harrison, the CEO of Aerodyne, was, in Robert's telling, a figure of almost mythical proportions. Harrison, my father would declare at family dinners, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation, is a visionary. a titan of industry. He has his finger on the pulse of the global aerospace market. In reality, Mr. Harrison was likely a competent, if somewhat overworked, executive managing a company that faced the same pressures and uncertainties as any other in its sector. But in Robert's mind, he was a kingmaker, a man whose approval was the ultimate validation. The news that Mr. Harrison will be making a brief stop at their house this evening had thrown my father into a state of barely concealed panic all week. The lawn had been mowed twice, the silverware polished to a blinding gleam, and my mother had been subjected to a relentless series of anxious inquiries about the menu, the wine selection, the state of the guest bathroom. "It's just a quick drop in, Robert," my mother had tried to reassure him. "He's on his way to a charity gala downtown, just swinging by to pick up those revised schematics you finished for him. He probably won't even stay for a drink." But Robert was not to be placated. This was an opportunity, he felt, to impress the great man, to demonstrate the order and respectability of his household, perhaps even to subtly position himself for what, he was never quite clear. A promotion? A special project? Or simply a nod of approval from the Titan himself? My sister Brenda, oblivious to this undercurrent of paternal anxiety, or perhaps deliberately ignoring it, had chosen this particular evening to launch her assault on my character. Her timing, as always, was impeccably self-absorbed. Gary, her echo chamber of a husband, continued to interject with supportive inanities. "Absolutely, Bren. It's about creating value. That's what Mr. Harrison understands. Value, not just marching around in a uniform." I wondered if Gary had any idea that Mr. Harrison's company, Aerodyne, held several lucrative defense contracts, supplying critical components for some of the very aircraft and systems my marching around involved. The irony was a rich, dark vein running through this increasingly surreal family gathering. My mother, bless her heart, was trying valiantly to steer the conversation into safer waters. "Michael, dear," she said, her voice a little too bright, "tell us about your latest posting. Is it somewhere interesting?" Before I could answer, Brenda cut in. "Oh, Mother, who cares? It's probably just some dusty desert or another godforsaken jungle. The point is, it's not here. It's not building a life, a community, a legacy." Legacy. That was another of her new buzzwords, likely gleaned from the same source as personal branding. Her idea of legacy, I suspected, involved a large inheritance and a wing of the local museum named after her, funded by someone else's endeavors. My own definition of legacy was perhaps less tangible, residing in the anechoic chambers of national security, in the quiet competence of the men and women I led, in the stability of regions that might otherwise descend into chaos. But these were not concepts that translated well into Brenda's lexicon of immediate gratification and material display. My father, meanwhile, was starting to look genuinely distressed, not by Brenda's attack on me, but by the dawning realization that this unseemly family squabble might coincide with Mr. Harrison's imminent arrival. His face was pale, a sheen of perspiration on his forehead. He shot a nervous glance at the grandfather clock in the hall, its heavy pendulum marking the relentless march towards his moment of potential social triumph, or, increasingly likely, abject humiliation. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He had, after all, consistently failed to offer even a token defense of my life's work against Brenda's casual derision. He had chosen the path of least resistance, of familial appeasement, and now he was about to reap the awkward, uncomfortable whirlwind. I decided to offer a small, almost imperceptible olive branch, not for Brenda's sake, but for my mother's, who was looking increasingly wretched. "Actually, Mother," I said, my voice calm, and even my current posting is quite engaging. "I'm working with a multinational task force on developing new protocols for cybersecurity in contested environments. It involves a great deal of strategic planning and international cooperation. Quite fascinating, really." Brenda snorted. "Cybersecurity. Sounds thrilling. Probably just means you sit in a dark room staring at a computer all day. Gary's actually out there, meeting people, closing deals, making things happen." "Indeed," I said, a faint smile touching my lips. "The things I try to make happen or prevent from happening, tend to involve rather more significant consequences than a missed sales quota, Gary. But I'm sure your work is very dynamic. Gary bristled, but before he could retort, the doorbell chimed, a clear, authoritative sound that seemed to cut through the strained atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. My father leaped to his feet as if electrocuted. That'll be him. That'll be Mr. Harrison. Everyone, please just be normal. He smoothed his tie, ran a hand over his thinning hair, and practically sprinted to the front door, his earlier anxieties now replaced by a desperate, almost manic, attempt to project an image of calm, successful domesticity. The stage was set. The principal actors were in place, and the uninvited guest, the catalyst for the evening's denouement, was about to make his entrance. I took another sip of water, my internal assessment matrix calculating the probable impact of this new variable on the existing domestic conflict. The readings were intriguing. The dinner, which had already been navigating the choppy waters of familial discord, now lurched into a new, more acute phase of awkwardness. My father, Robert, practically radiated anxiety as he fussed over final preparations for Mr. Harrison's arrival, straightening already straight picture frames, an activity I recognized as a displacement behavior from my observations of young lieutenants before their first major inspection. My mother, Eleanor, bless her, was attempting to maintain a veneer of calm, offering quiet reassurances that only seemed to amplify Robert's agitation. Brenda and Gary, temporarily silenced by the impending arrival of a bona fide titan of industry, at least in Robert's estimation, exchanged superior glances, as if this brief visit from Sil somehow validated their own materialistic worldview. I remained a quiet observer, a detached analyst watching a complex human experiment unfold. My own feelings were a curious mixture of mild amusement and a detached professional interest in the group dynamics at play. The tension in the room was palpable, a low-frequency hum of social anxiety and unspoken resentments. When the doorbell finally chimed, it was as if a starting pistol had been fired. Robert practically vaulted from his chair, his face a mask of forced bonhomie. "That will be him. Alistair, so good of you to come," he boomed, flinging open the door to reveal a man who was, in reality, far less imposing than the legend Robert had constructed. Alistair Harrison was perhaps in his late 50s, of medium height, dressed in a well-cut but understated suit, his demeanor one of quiet, professional competence rather than flamboyant corporate power. He had a tired but intelligent look in his eyes, the weary pragmatism of a man who carried significant responsibilities. "Robert, good to see you," Mr. Harrison said, his voice calm and measured, offering a firm handshake. "Sorry to intrude on your Sunday evening. Just needed those revised schematics for the morning meeting." "No intrusion at all, Alistair. A pleasure, an absolute pleasure. Come in, meet the family." Robert practically dragged him into the dining room, his voice a little too loud, his gestures a little too expansive. He performed the introductions with a flourish. "This is my wife, Eleanor, of course, and my daughter, Brenda, and her husband, Gary. Brenda is a real go-getter, a marketing whiz, and Gary here is a top salesman in his field, a real rainmaker." Brenda and Gary preened under the praise, offering Mr. Harrison dazzling, if somewhat artificial, smiles. Mr. Harrison nodded politely to each of them, his gaze courteous but brief. His eyes then swept the room, and it was then that they landed on me. I was still seated at the table, having made no move to join the fawning reception committee. For a moment, there was no visible reaction from Mr. Harrison. He simply looked at me, a slight frown creasing his brow, as if trying to place a familiar face in an unexpected context. Then his eyes widened, just a fraction, but enough for me to notice. A look of dawning recognition, followed by something else, surprise, and then, unmistakably, respect. He disengaged from Robert's effusive grip and took a step towards me, his hand extended. "Colonel Anderson," he said, his voice suddenly imbued with a different timbre, a note of genuine deference that cut through the room's forced conviviality like a laser. "What an unexpected honor to find you here, sir. I had no idea you were Robert's son. The words, sir, delivered with a natural, almost unconscious respect, hung in the air. The effect on my family was instantaneous and profound. Brenda's jaw, which had been set in a look of smug superiority, literally dropped. Gary, who had been about to launch into an anecdote about his latest sales triumph, froze mid-gesture, his mouth agape. My mother looked from Mr. Harrison to me, a bewildered but slowly dawning pride in her eyes. And my father, Robert, just stared, his face a comical mask of utter astonishment, as if a hitherto unknown species had just materialized at his dinner table. I rose slowly from my chair and shook Mr. Harrison's offered hand. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice calm, my grip firm. "A pleasure to see you again. I wasn't aware you knew my father personally, beyond your professional association." "Knew him?" Mr. Harrison chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. "Robert is one of my most reliable project managers, Colonel. A good man. But I confess, he's been rather modest about his family connections. He never mentioned his son was well, you." He turned to Robert, a new, appraising look in his eye. "Robert, you old dog, you've been holding out on me. You have a national hero in the family, and you never thought to mention it." Robert, still reeling from the shock, could only stammer. Well, Michael, he's always been rather quiet about his work, Alistair. Very modest, you know. Modest. That was one interpretation. Another might be that he had been actively downplaying, or perhaps was genuinely ignorant of, the true nature and significance of my career. Brenda, recovering her composure, though her face was still flushed, attempted to interject. "Well, Mr. Harrison, we're all very proud of Michael, of course. It's just that his line of work is so different from ours. We don't always understand the details." Her voice lacked its earlier confident derision. It was now tinged with a new, uncertain deference. Mr. Harrison looked at her, then back at me, a knowing glint in his eye, as if he understood far more than he was letting on about the preceding family dynamics. "Different, perhaps, Ms. Brenda," she supplied a little too quickly. "Brenda Wallace." "Brenda," Mr. Harrison acknowledged with a nod. "But I assure you, the details of Colonel Anderson's work are rather significant. In fact," he turned back to me, "Colonel, I was just reading your latest monograph on strategic resource allocation in asymmetric warfare environments. Brilliant stuff. Absolutely brilliant. We've circulated it among our senior executive team at Aerodyne. Has direct applications to some of our long-term risk assessment modeling for global supply chains. My monograph, a dense, academic paper I'd published in a specialist defense journal. Hardly light reading for a corporate CEO. Yet Harrison had not only read it, but had grasped its strategic implications. The silence from Brenda and Gary was now absolute. Their faces were a study in deflated arrogance. Gary, the rainmaker, looked as if he'd just been caught in a sudden, unexpected downpour. The load-bearing wall, it seemed, had just been publicly stress-tested by an unimpeachable authority, and its integrity confirmed. The decorative facades, however, were beginning to show some rather alarming cracks. The atmosphere in the dining room had undergone a seismic shift. The casual disdain that Brenda and Gary had so freely dispensed only moments before had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, awkward deference. My father, Robert, was still grappling with the cognitive dissonance of his modest son being addressed as Sir and lauded as a national hero by the very he so assiduously tried to impress. My mother, Eleanor, however, was quietly beaming, a subtle but unmistakable pride illuminating her gentle features. Mr. Harrison, seemingly oblivious to the domestic tempest he had inadvertently calmed, or perhaps keenly aware and subtly enjoying the effect, continued to engage me in conversation. "Colonel, we're actually hosting a small, off-the-record symposium next month on emerging geopolitical risks and their impact on global manufacturing. Several underscore from the Pentagon will be there, along with a few key industry leaders. I'd be honored if you would consider being our keynote speaker. Your insights on supply chain vulnerabilities and conflict zones would be invaluable." A keynote speaker. at a symposium with Pentagon analysts and industry leaders. I glanced at Brenda. Her face was a mask of disbelief. Just minutes ago, she had been lecturing me on the importance of building a personal brand. Now, her brother, the one who played soldier and didn't contribute to the real economy, was being invited to share his expertise with the very titans of industry she and Gary so desperately aspired to emulate. "That's a very generous offer, Mr. Harrison," I replied. "My schedule is rather demanding at present, but I would certainly be willing to review the agenda and see if my participation is feasible." "Excellent, excellent," Mr. Harrison enthused. "My assistant will be in touch. And Robert," he turned to my father, who was still looking somewhat dazed, "you must be incredibly proud of this young man. His strategic acumen is quite remarkable. We've tried, on more than one occasion, to lure him into the private sector when his current commission ends. A man of his caliber could write his own ticket at Aerodyne, I assure you. Write his own ticket. At Aerodyne, the company where my father had toiled for decades, hoping for a nod of approval, a minor promotion. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast." Robert managed a weak, slightly strangled smile. "Yes, Alistair. Yes, of course. Very proud. Michael, he's always been a high achiever." His voice lacked conviction, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as Mr. Harrison. Gary, ever the opportunist, saw a potential opening. He cleared his throat, a nervous, ingratiating sound. "Mr. Harrison, sir, if I may be so bold, Colonel Anderson, Michael, has always been an inspiration to us all. His dedication is truly something. In fact, my company, Protech Solutions, we do a bit of work with logistics software. Perhaps there might be some synergies, some way we could support the Colonel's efforts or even Aerodyne's interests in cybersecurity." His attempt to pivot, to ingratiate himself, was clumsy, transparent. Mr. Harrison gave him a cool, appraising look, the kind a seasoned executive reserves for an unsolicited and poorly timed sales pitch. "Protech Solutions, you say? I'm not familiar with them. But I assure you, Mr. Wallace." "Gary Wallace," he supplied, his smile wavering slightly under Harrison's scrutiny. "Mr. Wallace, Aerodyne, and indeed the Department of Defense, have extremely rigorous procurement protocols and highly specialized cybersecurity partners. But I appreciate your enthusiasm." The dismissal, though polite, was unmistakable. Gary deflated visibly, his rainmaker persona momentarily short-circuited. Brenda, sensing her husband's humiliation, shot me a look that was a complex mixture of resentment and a grudging, bewildered respect. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. The man they had dismissed as nothing was now the focus of admiration and deference from the one person whose opinion seemed to matter most to them. My mother, seeing an opportunity to restore some semblance of normalcy, or perhaps just to escape the excruciating awkwardness, interjected. "Alistair, would you care for a drink? Some coffee, perhaps? Or Robert has some excellent single malt he's been saving." "That's very kind, Eleanor," Mr. Harrison said, his attention shifting smoothly to her. "But I really must be going. I just needed those schematics from Robert." He glanced at his watch. "The gala starts in an hour, but perhaps another time. And Colonel," he turned back to me, his handshake firm once more, "I truly hope you'll consider the symposium. It would be a significant contribution." "I will indeed, Mr. Harrison," I said. "Thank you again for the invitation." My father, finally jolted back into action, scurried off to retrieve the schematics, his earlier grandiosity replaced by a flustered, almost subservient efficiency. Mr. Harrison accepted the role of blueprints, offered his thanks again, nodded politely to the assembled family, and then, with a final, respectful nod to me, he was gone. The front door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving a silence in the dining room that was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of shattered illusions, of recalibrated perceptions, of a family hierarchy that had just been unceremoniously and irrevocably redrawn, not by any action of my own, but by the simple, unvarnished truth of a world they had never bothered to understand. The load-bearing wall had been revealed, and the decorative facades looked suddenly, painfully inadequate. The departure of Alastair Harrison left a vacuum in the room, a palpable void where just moments before, his presence had reshaped the familiar contours of our family dynamic. For a long moment, no one spoke. Brenda stared at the floral centerpiece as if it held the secrets of the universe. Gary was examining his cuticles with an intensity usually reserved for his quarterly sales reports. My mother, Eleanor, was quietly collecting the dessert plates, her movements betraying a mixture of relief and a subtle, lingering pride. My father, Robert, stood by the window, his back to the room, gazing out at the darkening garden as if contemplating the mysteries of his own misjudgments. It was he who finally broke the silence, his voice subdued, almost hesitant. Well, that was Alastair Harrison. An observation of profound banality, yet it hung in the air, laden with unspoken implications. He seemed to think quite highly of you, Michael, my mother said, her voice gentle, as she carried a stack of plates towards the kitchen. It wasn't an accusation, nor was it a revelation to her, I suspected. It was simply a statement of fact, a quiet affirmation of what she had perhaps always known, or at least hoped. Brenda finally looked up, her expression a confusing cocktail of resentment, bewilderment, and a grudging, nascent respect. A national hero, she said, the words sounding foreign on her tongue. A keynote speaker at a Pentagon symposium? Why didn't you ever tell us, Michael? The question was absurd, yet entirely predictable. In her world, achievements were things to be trumpeted, to be leveraged for social and financial gain. The idea of quiet competence, of service performed without fanfare, was alien to her. Tell you what, Brenda, I replied, my tone neutral, that I take my work seriously, that I've dedicated my life to it. I assumed that was evident. The specific details, the monographs, the symposiums, they're part of the job. Not particularly riveting dinner conversation, I wouldn't have thought, especially when compared to Gary's software deals or your latest personal branding initiatives. My words were not intended to be sarcastic, merely factual, yet a faint flush rose on Brenda's cheeks. Gary shifted uncomfortably. Well, still, Brenda persisted, though with less of her earlier bluster. It's just surprising. We had no idea you were so important. Important. There was that word again. Her definition of importance was clearly undergoing a rapid, if painful, revision. My father turned from the window, his face etched with a complex emotion I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even embarrassment, not entirely. It was something closer to confusion. As if a familiar piece of furniture in his mental landscape had suddenly revealed itself to be a priceless antique he'd been using as a footstool. Michael, he began, his voice still a little shaky. Those things Harrison said about Aerodyne trying to recruit you, about you writing your own ticket, he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Mr. Harrison has always been very generous in his assessment of my potential contributions to the private sector, Dad, I said. We've had several informal discussions over the years. But my commitment, as you know, has been elsewhere. But a man of his caliber, Robert gestured vaguely. To speak of you with such respect, he seemed to be grappling with a new, uncomfortable reality, that his own son, the quiet, unassuming soldier, might actually command more genuine respect in the corridors of power than he, Robert Anderson, senior project manager, did. It was a fundamental reordering of his personal hierarchy, and it was clearly unsettling. Respect, Dad, I said, choosing my words carefully, is generally earned, not bestowed. Mr. Harrison and I operate in spheres where competence and integrity are the primary currencies. Titles and salaries are secondary. My mother returned from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Robert, then at Brenda and Gary, then at me. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Well, she said, her voice deceptively light, it seems we've all learned something new this evening. Perhaps it's time we had some of that apple pie I made. Michael, dear, you always loved my apple pie. It was her way of diffusing the tension, of trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to an evening that had been anything but. We ate the pie in a strangely subdued atmosphere. The earlier acrimony was gone, replaced by a wary, uncertain politeness. Brenda and Gary were uncharacteristically quiet, occasionally stealing glances at me as if seeing me for the first time. My father picked at his pie, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Only my mother seemed to retain her usual gentle composure, though I noticed her gaze resting on me more frequently, a warmth in her eyes that felt like a balm after the earlier chill. As I was preparing to leave, my father walked me to the door. The awkwardness between us was palpable. "Michael," he said, his hand on the doorknob, "about what Brenda said earlier about you not being—" He struggled for the words. I don't agree with her. Of course not. Your mother and I, we've always been proud." The word proud sounded a little forced, a little too late, but I recognized the effort it cost him. He was a man confronting his own limitations, his own long-held, unexamined prejudices. "Thank you, Dad," I said simply. There was no need for more. He understood, or at least he was beginning to. As I drove away from my parents' house, the streetlights casting long shadows, I reflected on the evening's unexpected drama. It hadn't been my intention to cause a family crisis, to upend their comfortable assumptions. But sometimes the truth has a way of emerging, unbidden, like a deeply buried geological fault line, suddenly shifting and reshaping the landscape. Brenda's insult, meant to diminish me, had inadvertently triggered a seismic event that had revealed far more about her and about my father than it had about me. My worth, my manhood, was not defined by their flawed perceptions or their narrow definitions of success. It was forged in the crucible of command, in the quiet execution of duty, in the unwavering commitment to principles they seemed unable to grasp. Mr. Harrison's unexpected intervention had merely illuminated what was already there, a load-bearing wall of character and accomplishment that had stood firm, unnoticed, and unappreciated by those closest to it, until an external force had inadvertently revealed its true strength. The decorative facades of their own lives, however, now looked decidedly less stable. The days following that memorable Sunday dinner were marked by a subtle but significant shift in the family dynamic, or at least in my perception of it. Brenda called a few days later, her tone uncharacteristically subdued. It wasn't an outright apology. That would have been too much to expect, but rather a rambling, somewhat incoherent attempt to clarify her earlier remarks. She claimed she'd been stressed and hadn't expressed herself properly. She even invited me to a tedious networking event her company was hosting, an invitation I politely declined, citing prior commitments, a staff ride at the National Training Center, a detail I omitted. Gary, when I next encountered him at a family birthday party a few weeks later, was almost obsequious, peppering me with questions about geopolitical strategy and leadership challenges, his eyes wide with a newfound, if somewhat opportunistic, respect. He even offered to send me a complimentary copy of his company's latest logistics software, an offer I managed to deflect with a vague promise to look into it when I had a moment. My father, Robert, was the most changed, or perhaps the most revealed. He began to call me more frequently, not just for the perfunctory check-ins of the past, but to genuinely ask about my work, my well-being. He'd mentioned Mr. Harrison in a new, almost proprietary way, as if their shared acquaintance with me had somehow elevated his own standing. "Alistair was asking after you the other day. Michael," he'd say, "wanted to know if you'd made a decision about that symposium." He started sending me articles he thought might interest me, clippings from aerospace journals or defense industry newsletters, often with handwritten notes in the margin. "Thought this might be relevant to your work." It was a clumsy, awkward attempt to bridge the gap that had existed between us for so long, a belated recognition of a world he had previously dismissed. I appreciated the effort, even if it was tinged with a certain degree of self-interest on his part, a desire to bask in the reflected glow of his son's newly validated status. My mother, Eleanor, was simply relieved. The constant, low-grade tension that had characterized our family gatherings whenever Brenda was present seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a more cautious, respectful equilibrium. She told me once, during a quiet phone call, "Your father, he sees you differently now, Michael." I think Mr. Harrison's visit, it opened his eyes. He's always been proud of you, deep down. He didn't always know how to show it or how to reconcile it with his own ideas of success. Perhaps she was right, or perhaps she was, as always, trying to smooth the rough edges of our family's complex emotional terrain. The symposium Mr. Harrison had invited me to address was, as it turned out, a significant event. The audience comprised senior executives from major defense and technology firms, analysts from various intelligence agencies, and several high-ranking military officers from allied nations. My keynote address, on the future of hybrid warfare and its implications for national security and global commerce, was well received. Mr. Harrison made a point of introducing me to several influential attendees afterwards, his pride in my association with Aerodyne, however tangential, quite evident. During a coffee break, a retired four-star general, a man I'd admired from afar for years, approached me. "Colonel Anderson," he said, his handshake firm, "that was a masterclass in strategic thinking. Your analysis of resource vulnerabilities was particularly trenchant. We need more minds like yours focused on these challenges, both in uniform and, eventually, in the civilian sector." We spoke for nearly half an hour, a conversation that ranged from geopolitical fault lines to the ethical dilemmas of emerging military technologies. It was the kind of substantive, deeply engaging dialogue that I rarely experienced outside my professional sphere, certainly not at my parents' dinner table. As I was leaving the symposium, Mr. Harrison caught up with me. "Michael," he said, using my first name for the first time, a subtle but significant shift that was outstanding. "Truly, the offer to join Aerodyne when you decide to hang up your uniform, it's a standing one. And I mean a very senior, strategic role. Think about it." I thanked him, genuinely appreciative of his confidence. The irony was not lost on me. The real man my sister had accused me of not being was now being actively courted by the very CEO whose approval my father and brother-in-law so desperately craved. The world, it seemed, had its own way of conducting stress tests and revealing structural integrity. The experience didn't change my fundamental view of myself or my career. I hadn't sought external validation, and its unexpected arrival, while certainly gratifying on some level, didn't alter my core values. My commitment was still to my country, to the men and women under my command, to the principles of duty and honor that had guided me for 3 decades. But it did, perhaps, offer a new perspective on my family. They were flawed, limited by their own experiences and anxieties, just as I was by mine. Their inability to understand my world was not necessarily a reflection of my inadequacy, but of their own. Respect, I realized, was not something one could demand, especially from family. It was either given freely, born of understanding and empathy, or it was not. And if it was not, then one had to find it elsewhere, in the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, in the esteem of one's peers, in the unwavering knowledge of one's own worth, a worth not measured by bank balances or social accolades, but by the bedrock of character and the load-bearing walls of integrity. That Sunday dinner, with its casual cruelty and unexpected revelations, had become a peculiar kind of gift. It had stripped away the last vestiges of any lingering need I might have had for my family's conventional approval. It had liberated me to fully inhabit the life I had chosen, the life I had built on my own terms according to my own, more rigorous specifications. The decorative facades might continue to crumble and shift, but the foundations, I knew, were sound. The months following the symposium and the subsequent subtle recalibration within my family settled into a new kind of normal. The change wasn't dramatic or overt. There were no tearful apologies from Brenda, no grand pronouncements of newfound understanding from my father. Instead, it was a series of small adjustments, a quiet redrawing of boundaries, a tacit acknowledgement that my life, my career, held a weight and a significance they had previously failed to recognize. My father Robert, continued his efforts to connect with me on a more professional level. He'd send me links to articles about defense policy or aerospace innovation, often with a note saying, "Thought you'd find this interesting, Michael." Harrison mentioned something similar last week. It was his way, I realized, of trying to enter my world, to find common ground on a terrain where he now perceived me as an authority. I appreciated the gesture, responding to his emails with a courtesy and patience I might not have always shown in the past. The old desire for his unqualified approval had faded, replaced by a more mature understanding of his limitations and a quiet acceptance of the relationship we had, rather than the one I might once have wished for. Brenda and Gary remained largely on the periphery of my life, our interactions limited to obligatory family gatherings. Their tone towards me was now one of cautious, almost exaggerated, respect. The dismissive remarks about my career ceased entirely. Instead, they would ask vague, slightly odd questions about my important work, their eyes holding a mixture of curiosity and a lingering incomprehension. Gary even once tried to pitch me on a revolutionary new encryption software his company was tangentially involved with, an offer I politely but firmly declined, explaining that the Department of Defense had its own, rather more robust solutions. The irony of Gary, the purveyor of mid-level software, offering cybersecurity advice to a colonel specializing in contested digital environments, was not lost on me, but I let it pass without comment. My mother, Eleanor, was perhaps the one who derived the most quiet satisfaction from a shift. She no longer felt the need to constantly defend my choices or explain my absences. There was a new lightness in her demeanor when we spoke, a sense of validated pride that she no longer had to keep hidden. "Your father told me Mr. Harrison mentioned you in a board meeting last week," she'd say, a subtle smile in her voice. "Something about your strategic insights being invaluable to their long-term planning." The true impact of that Sunday dinner, however, was less about how my family perceived me and more about how I perceived myself in relation to them. The casual cruelty of Brenda's words, "You're not a real man," had initially stung, not because I believed them, but because they represented such a profound and willful misunderstanding of everything I stood for. But the subsequent events, the unintentional validation by Mr. Harrison, had served as a powerful antidote. It wasn't that I needed a civilian CEO to affirm my worth. My worth was affirmed every day by the trust placed in me by my superiors, by the dedication of the men and women I led, by the tangible impact of our collective efforts on national security. What Mr. Harrison's intervention had done was to hold up a mirror to my family, forcing them to confront the chasm between their perception of me and the reality. It was a stark, uncomfortable lesson for them, but one that, I hoped, might lead to a more mature, more respectful understanding in the long run. I continued my career, my focus unwavering. There were new challenges, new deployments, new strategic puzzles to solve. My work remained demanding, often all-consuming, but it was work that mattered, work that had a purpose beyond the accumulation of wealth or the pursuit of fleeting social status. I thought often of George, my late father-in-law from a previous marriage, a man who had understood the value of solid foundations. His words, "A real man, Veronica, understands the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative facade," had become a kind of personal mantra for me. He had been speaking of my ex-wife's superficiality then, but the metaphor resonated deeply with my own family's struggles to see beyond the surface. My family, with their focus on the decorative facades of civilian success, had failed to see the load-bearing walls of character, duty, and sacrifice that defined my life. They had mistaken the quiet strength of steel and concrete for the inertness of unadorned earth. Mr. Harrison, a man who dealt in the real-world consequences of structural integrity, both in aerospace engineering and in global markets, had recognized those foundations immediately. His respect was not for a title, but for the proven capacity, the demonstrated competence, the strategic mind he saw before him. That, I realized, was the ultimate validation, not the sudden, awkward deference of my family, but the quiet, professional esteem of a man who understood the true meaning of strength and the critical importance of well-designed, resilient structures. My life was one such structure, built over decades of discipline and dedication. And it would continue to stand, long after the decorative facades of fleeting trends and superficial judgments had crumbled into dust. The definition of a real man, I concluded, was not something to be debated at a dinner table, but something to be demonstrated quietly and consistently in the challenging arenas of life, where integrity is the bedrock and courage the unyielding steel. The long arc of a military career inevitably bends toward a transition point, a time when a uniform is hung up for the last time and a new chapter begins. For me, that transition arrived a few years after the memorable Sunday dinner, not with a sense of loss, but with a quiet anticipation for what lay ahead. My final posting had been a rewarding one, a senior strategic role at the Pentagon, shaping policy that would impact national security for years to come. The work was intellectually stimulating, the challenges immense, but the relentless pace and the constant, high-stakes pressure had taken their toll. It was time for a different kind of engagement. Alastair Harrison's offer to join Aerodyne in a senior executive capacity had remained open, a testament to his belief in the transferability of military leadership skills to the corporate world. After careful consideration and several in-depth discussions with Harrison about the specific nature of the role, Vice President for Global Risk and Strategic Development, I accepted. It was a position that would leverage my decades of experience in geopolitical analysis, logistical planning, and crisis management, applying those skills to the complex, often volatile, landscape of international business. My transition to civilian life was smoother than I had anticipated, perhaps because the role at Aerodyne felt like a natural extension of my military career, albeit with different metrics of success. The boardroom, I discovered, had its own unique battle rhythms, its own strategic challenges, its own forms of asymmetrical warfare, fought with spreadsheets and market projections rather than ordnance and troop deployments. My family, predictably, reacted to my new career with a mixture of awe and a renewed, if somewhat belated, appreciation. My father, Robert, was particularly gratified. His son, the once perplexing soldier, was now a vice president at the very company where he had spent his entire working life, a colleague, in a sense, of the great Alastair Harrison. It was a narrative he could understand, a form of success that fit neatly into his established worldview. Michael, VP at Aerodyne, he would announce proudly at family gatherings, as if this new title somehow validated all the preceding years. Working directly with Harrison, on global strategy. Very important stuff. Brenda and Gary, too, seemed impressed, though their understanding of my actual responsibilities remained vague. They were more interested in the perceived perks, the executive salary, the corporate expense account, the impressive office. "So, Michael," Gary asked once, a hopeful gleam in his eye, "now that you're on the inside at Aerodyne, maybe you could put in a good word for ProTech Solutions? We've got some new AI-driven inventory management software that could revolutionize their supply chain." I had politely explained that Aerodyne's procurement processes were somewhat more complex than that, and that my role was focused on strategic risk, not software acquisition. His disappointment was palpable. My mother, Eleanor, was simply happy to have me home more often, to see me settled in a less perilous, if still demanding, profession. She worried less, though she still sent me care packages filled with homemade cookies, a habit from my long years of deployment that she seemed reluctant to relinquish. One evening, about a year into my tenure at Aerodyne, Alastair Harrison invited me for a quiet dinner at his club. We spoke for hours, not just about corporate strategy and market fluctuations, but about leadership, about the challenges of navigating complex organizations, about the importance of integrity in a world often driven by short-term gains. Michael, Harrison said, swirling the brandy in his snifter, when I first met you at Robert's house that Sunday, I confess I was taken aback. Robert had never mentioned his son was, you. I knew Colonel Michael Anderson by reputation, of course. Your work on hybrid threat environments was groundbreaking. To find you sitting at that dinner table, being lectured by your sister about personal branding, it was quite the disconnect. I smiled. Families can be complex entities, Alistair." "Indeed," he chuckled. "But it was your composure that impressed me most. The quiet strength, the refusal to be drawn into their petty squabbles. That, Michael, is true leadership. It's a quality far rarer and far more valuable than any MBA or flashy sales record." His words, offered without fanfare, meant more to me than any promotion or public accolade. It was a recognition from a man I respected, a man who understood the often unseen foundations upon which true success is built. My life had taken an unexpected turn, but the core principles remained the same. Whether in uniform or a business suit, the mission was always about understanding the terrain, assessing the risks, building resilient structures, and leading with integrity. The decorative facades of the world would always exist, their allure tempting those who valued appearance over substance. But the load-bearing walls, the quiet strength of character, the bedrock of earned respect, these were the elements that truly endured. And as I looked out at the city lights from the window of Harrison's Club, I felt a profound sense of peace. The boy who had sought purpose in the disciplined ranks of the army had become the man who now helped guide a global corporation through the complexities of an uncertain world. The journey had been long, often arduous, but it had been real. And that, I knew, was what truly counted. The years at Aerodyne proved to be as challenging and rewarding as my military career, albeit in different ways. The strategic planning, the geopolitical risk assessments, the mentoring of young executives, it all drew upon the core competencies I had honed over 3 decades in uniform. Alistair Harrison became not just a boss, but a trusted colleague and a friend. We shared a similar worldview, a belief in principled leadership and long-term vision over short-sighted expediency. My relationship with my family also found a more stable, if somewhat formal, equilibrium. My father, Robert, took immense pride in my position at Aerodyne, often regaling his friends with slightly exaggerated tales of my corporate exploits. It was as if my success in a field he understood finally allowed him to fully acknowledge the son he had, rather than the one he had perhaps once wished for. Brenda and Gary, while never truly grasping the complexities of my work, treated me with a newfound respect, born more of my title and perceived influence than any genuine understanding of my character. It was a superficial respect, to be sure, but it made family gatherings considerably less fraught. My mother, Eleanor, remained my steadfast, quiet supporter, her pride in me unwavering, whether I was in a combat zone or a boardroom. She was the constant, the emotional bedrock of our often fractured family. One cool autumn evening, several years into my tenure at Aerodyne, I received an invitation to speak at my old alma mater, the military academy that had set me on my path so many years ago. The invitation was to deliver the keynote address at the annual leadership forum for graduating cadets. It was an honor I accepted without hesitation. Standing on that familiar stage, looking out at the sea of young, eager faces in their crisp, gray uniforms, I felt a profound sense of connection, a closing of a circle. I spoke not of battlefield heroics or grand strategic victories, but of the quieter, often unseen aspects of leadership, integrity,